Hello class! This week we are going to discuss exactly how the war is beginning. It's called Europe Plunges into War. Here are our objectives. By the end of this lecture and by the end of the week, you will be able to describe the reaction of Austria's declaration of war. You will be able to summarize the military events on the Western Front. And you will also be able to explain the development of war on the Eastern Front. Okay? We will discuss exactly what is the Western Front and what is the Eastern Front in this lecture. The Great War begins. So last week we learned about the Archduke Franz Ferdinand being shot. This is a single event, or the shot that was heard around Europe, that starts the war. The way that it starts the war is because Serbia is linked with Russia. So Austria declares war on Serbia for shooting their archbishop. Russia then declares war on Austria. Once Russia declares war on Germany, they mobilize their army. That means that they move their army to the Russian and German border. Because Germany had already expected that France was going to declare war, they actually declare war on France first. So all of a sudden we have France is now involved. Lastly, we have Britain declares war a little bit later on Germany as well. So now we have most of the European countries have now declared war on each other. So as I said, we have Germany declares war on Russia, quickly attacks France, France then declares war, and then lastly Britain. What we have is that these nations are taking sides. So by 1914, we have two main sides. We have the Central Powers. The Central Powers are the countries in the middle. That is Germany, Austria, and Hungary, are the main Central Powers. The Allied Powers, they are Britain, France, and Russia. Now, to note, we have two countries who start out neutral in 1914 and end up joining the Central Powers. These two countries are Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire. The reason why they joined the Central Powers is they are hoping to gain back land that they had lost earlier in the 19th century. Now for the Allied powers, we have a huge change. The first change is Italy. Now if you remember from last week, Italy was actually a part of an alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary. Well, all of a sudden, Italy switches sides to the Allies. And the reason why Italy does that is because they believe that Austria-Hungary picked a fight with Serbia and wanted to start a world war. Italy did not like how Austria-Hungary took over Bosnia and Herzegovina. So they aligned themselves with the Allies. Now to be clear, most soldiers thought that this was going to be a short battle. Most of Europe did not expect that this was going to be a war that would last years and would actually change war in the whole world. A bloody stalemate. What ends up happening is we have two fronts that start to develop where war takes place. The first front is called the Western Front. The Western Front is the north border between France and Germany. Okay? So if we were to think of the Western Front, it is right here. The Western Front reaches Belgium and the northern part of France that is met by Germany. Okay? Now, Germany, because they are surrounded by the Allied powers, they had a plan. They called this plan the Schlieffen Plan. And what ends up happening is what the Germans decided to do was they were going to sweep into France and go to Paris and attack France first. The reason is they believed that Russia, because Russia was not as industrialized, they did not have the railway system like France, that they were going to defeat France first, then they were going to regroup and go to the Eastern Front. Now the Eastern Front, if you look on your map in your textbook on page 846, the Eastern Front is outlined in red. That is the front in the east that is met by Russia and parts of the Balkans. So they basically planned first attack France, then go and attack Russia. Now for the most part, the German army quickly moves into France, and they actually reach all the way into Paris. And it looks very good for the Germans at first. They basically believe that they have got Paris in the bag. That means that they have conquered Paris. But what ends up happening is that Germans actually lose the battle in Paris. This battle is called the Battle of Marne. What ends up happening is that the French, they regroup once they see the Germans are advancing in north of Paris. And they end up attacking, and while they're losing, they call for reinforcements. Now these reinforcements are brought to the front line by over 600 taxi cabs in Paris. So imagine all the taxi cabs in Taipei, or half of the taxi cabs in Taipei, opening their doors for soldiers and rushing those soldiers to the front line to defend France. That is exactly what happens at this first battle of Marne. Okay? What this means is that the Schlieffen plan fails. So the plan to attack France first, then rush off to go attack Russia, did not work for the Germans. As we can see here is a detailed plan of the Schlieffen plan. So here we have is the Western Front, okay? Especially this blue line is the Western Front. Germany believed that if they went through Belgium, that Belgium would not be protected by France, because all the French soldiers, they're going to be over here on the Western Front. So instead, they go through Belgium and go around to Paris. This is where the Battle of Marne happens. But, as we said, they lost this battle. Here's an example of, this is an actual picture taken of the Battle of Marne. Now, as you can see, there is trench warfare going on. We're going to discuss a little bit more about trench warfare in a minute. War in the trenches. Now, if you're unsure what a trench is, this is the first war that is known for trench warfare. Now, a trench is like a ditch, or a sort of a dug hole, or dug paths in the ground. What ends up happening is both sides end up digging these trenches or ditches as a way to protect themselves from the weapons or the machine guns that are firing at them. Okay? So many of these battles, they result in many deaths, but neither side really gains land because either side can hide in these sort of trenches. Most of the soldiers in World War I, they ended up living in these trenches. These trenches were one of the only safer places in battle, but they were miserable. If you imagine, like Taipei, Europe rains a lot, okay? Now imagine if you dug a hole in the mud, in a trench, and it rains, it's going to produce a lot of mud. That's exactly what these men are living in. They're showering in mud. They are living amongst mud. With mud, they have nowhere to go to the bathroom. So imagine you're mixing in your own urine and feces. The other thing is it attracts things like rats. So all of a sudden, you're living amongst rats. All the while, you have machine guns and different weapons being thrown at you, such as poison gas. So as you can imagine, if you were living in these trenches, it is quite horrible. The other thing is because the Industrial Revolution, And because of imperialism, many new weapons have been developed. And these weapons are known as killing machines. They can kill a lot of people. One example would be the machine gun. You're not only loading one bullet at a time. Now you can fire hundreds of bullets in a minute. This just leads to a lot of death. The last thing is we have this, because these new weapons, we have massive losses on both sides. So by 1916, we have the battles of Verdun and Somme. These battles are known as the brutal battlefields of death because of these weapons. So here's an example of trench warfare. These are the trenches. These are what soldiers have dug. And inside, they sort of build these cave-like things where they can seek shelter. Now, at certain times, if your officer orders you to attack, you are getting out of these trenches, you're going out and you are attacking against the other side's trenches. This area up here would be known as no man's land, okay? In the middle, the above ground, above the trenches is no man's land, sorry. So here, this is sort of what you're picturing when you picture World War I. You picture the soldier is in the trench, and this is a good way to cover him, and he's firing at the other side. Now when you are in the trench, you have all your equipment on you. Okay, so here you have a rifle, a haversack, that's a backpack, a helmet to protect yourself, you have something to eat with, you have your boots, shovel, etc. These are the types of things that you're looking at. Another important thing is the gas mask. This is the first World War, or the first war that uses things like poison gas to kill people as well. Again, here are some real-life pictures from World War I looking at trench warfare. As you can see, many people suffered from rot, as the feet over here. That means that your feet have been in mud and wet for so long that the skin actually rots off. Here we have men are eating rats. They've decided that they're so hungry and there's not a lot of food that rats are better meal than anything else. Again, this is another thing that starts to develop in World War I. This is the first time that we get something like a tank. Now, tanks are quite common when you think of warfare today, but World War I is the first time that they're using tanks. Now, this is sort of another death machine. We have people in the front firing away. These people are the only ones who can actually see what's ahead of them. Here we have another man sort of looking out at what's going on. And then up front we have more guns. Again, this is another modern warfare, poison gas. Many of the soldiers had to wear these gas masks in order to protect themselves. Often poison gas would cause rotting skin and sometimes even worse things like death. Battle on the Eastern Front. Now the Eastern Front, that is a side on the other side of Germany against Russia. Okay? This is where Germans and Russians are fighting. So the Western Front, that is where Germans and French are fighting. Now what Russians did is Russia actually first attacked Germany. But Germany counterattacked with more men and better weapons, and the Russians were forced to retreat. Now Russia, the reason why Russia struggles in this war is because Russia has not industrialized like the rest of the European countries. So by 1916, when Germany counterattacks against Russia, they lose over 30,000 people in their army. The reason is they have few supplies, they do not have much food, they do not have the same level of guns or modern warfare that Germany does. The only thing that Russia had going for it is the fact that Russia had a lot of people. They have a huge army. This is the only thing that Russia is their saving grace. Here's a picture of the front. Here are some pictures of the Eastern Front. We'll discuss more of the Eastern Front in class.